I had a director when I was teaching who he said, if the teacher is doing the majority of the work, then you're doing it wrong. And my daughter Amelia, who's 7 at the time, she looks up at me and she says, "Hey, couldn't we do a trip where it's just the kids leading the trip? Like the adults don't do any work?"
Was that hard for you to not interject or not do anything for them?
I mean, it was chaos in there. They were yelling at each other and everybody's trying to get a word in. And then eventually they figured out how to organize themselves. I want my kids to take themselves on an adventure and I will go along to make sure they can get there and get home. But as a teacher, I feel like a coach and a guide more than I'm just filling up kids with information. I think any teacher's goal at some point should be to become obsolete in your students' lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I get to watch that happen right before my eyes.
What if I told you that a story could teach your child more history, science, math, and literature than a year of textbooks? Welcome to the Story Schooling Podcast. I'm Angel Selden, author of Curiouser.
And I'm Sandy Fouts, co-founder of Wonder While Learning.
Well, good to see you again, Ben.
Good to see you too. It's been a long time.
I'm so excited to hear all your stories of wilderness adventuring.
Thank you for inviting me to talk about them. We love talking about our adventures here.
Yeah, well, you're passionate about it, and that's the whole idea. Is the thread that runs through all of our episodes is this idea of pursuing passion. So we interviewed a 23-year-old young woman who was raised immersed in stories and being able to pursue her passion of dance last week. And she talked about how in the Chronicles of Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they go into the wardrobe and then they come out. And she thought that that was a great metaphor for we go into the book, we get immersed in this imaginary world, and then we come out of it and we need to change and apply that to our lives, and we need to live life. And that's exactly why we're interviewing Ben today, is because Ben has taken his passion for wilderness adventuring, and instead of saying, I can't do that anymore because I have little kids now, and, we need to homeschool them and we need to give them an education. And so I need to put my passion and my interests on the back burner so that we can school them at home. He has actually taken this passion for wilderness adventuring and made that part of his family culture and the hinge on which a lot of their education rests on. Is that right?
That is right. Wilderness adventure has really shaped me as an adult and in my teaching career. And now I'm a homeschool dad and into my 8th year of trying to homeschool my kids and make sure we have enough adventure in our lives. And trip by trip, we keep just kind of building on what we've been doing.
Just to give a little background on Ben, Ben was a social studies teacher at a contract alternative high school in Minneapolis for 10 years before he had a family. And this contract school was for students who were struggling academically. They were significantly behind on credits, or they had behavior issues that kept them from being able to function in a regular classroom. He was an independent studies teacher and administrator for a project-based learning program at that same school for 7 years. He had 40 students per year. Those 40 students had all their classes through him. And I love this because we've talked about the importance of actually building a relationship with your mentor. And that becomes very difficult when you only have a mentor for an hour every other day with 25 other students. And as I've talked about in my book and in previous episodes, a lot of these principles of great mentorship were discovered by people who were educating children who were deemed uneducable or difficult to educate because they had no other option than to get creative. They weren't fitting into the traditional mold. And so Ben had this incredible opportunity, just like Anne Sullivan with Helen Keller and Susan Schaller with her student Ildefonso, who was deaf and had never learned language until she taught it to him when he was 27 years old, had a similar experience to that. Being responsible for mentoring and educating these 40 students who did not fit into the traditional classroom. He has guided monthly camping trips with an academic focus in all subject areas. So he has that transdisciplinary approach. Why don't you just share how you and your wife decided to start homeschooling and what that transition looked like?
Yeah, I never imagined I would be homeschooling. That was never the plan. And I taught all through my 30s. And and loved it. And as a career, I think I would have been happy doing that my entire life. When my daughter was born, shortly after, my wife got a job opportunity out in Seattle, which then uprooted us, moved us across the country, and suddenly I found myself as a stay-at-home dad and with this little baby and trying to figure out what are we going to do to fill up our day and how are we going to meet all of our people out here and find all of our places when we don't know anyone and we don't know where to go? And so everything that we've done from that point is kind of born out of that moment of just what are we going to do with ourselves with all of this time? And
So it segued very naturally from just raising toddlers and preschool aged kids into your homeschooling.
exactly,
Did it feel like a very natural segue? Yeah.
it was. The idea though that, like, all of the things that I'm doing as a dad at home, just like the daily things, there's no reason that we can't do these things at a state park. We can move the show on the road and we can travel around and see what happens. My wife was traveling at the time almost weekly, 2 to 3 nights sometimes, and so it'd be a lot of just me at home with this baby and trying to figure out how we're gonna do all this. And so every time mama went on a business trip, we're gonna go on a business trip. And so we were out in Seattle and every time she would go on a trip, we would go find some new spot within a couple hours and we would set up a tent and do a camping trip. And so this started at, I think Amelia was probably 14 months old at the time. So she was old enough to walk around and we could talk about things, but she wasn't walking very fast and she falls down a lot.
Is Amelia your oldest?
Yeah, Amelia's my oldest.
Okay.
She's 8 now. And then so we have 2. We have Amelia and we have James. So Amelia's 8 and James is now 5. He just turned 5 in August. And yeah, so it started month by month and we went on our first trip and it was to some little state park about a half an hour outside of Seattle. We set up and it made the mistake of taking us on July 5th, which was a weekend, fireworks going off. Our first trip was 2 o'clock in the morning and kid won't sleep and driving home in a panic and leaving all of our gear behind and having to come back the next day. I think like she was screaming her head off all night and she wouldn't sleep. And so we bailed and we ran home and like tails tucked between our legs and we ended up having to come back the next day, get our stuff. And I remember at that moment thinking, this is terrible. Like, I'm not sure I want to experience that again. And yet being excited about the idea of maybe trying to do this again, but maybe doing it a little smarter. And so I remember specifically sitting down with a notebook and writing down all of the mistakes that I made on the first trip. Don't go on the weekend. Don't go to a place they're shooting off fireworks because it's the day after Independence Day. Things like showing up early so that your kids got time to run around and get tired before you stick them in a tent and try to calm them down. And so this started to become kind of a tradition. We would go on trips, Amelia and I, and afterwards I would sit down with a notebook and just reflect on what it was that I should have done differently or what needs to get better each time. And so 4 days later, middle of the week, we went to a different spot that was quieter and it was still really hard. But there we were on a beach and there's my daughter running around and picking up rocks and showing them to me and watching the sunset and just sitting with her on a log and watching it go down and have a quiet moment. And she still didn't sleep real well, but it was better. She got enough sleep that we could function the next day. And I started to realize at that point that we were maybe onto something, that we could keep doing this. There was going to need to be some growth on my part to grow with this.
So what happened when it came time for kindergarten registration? At what point did you decide, let's just keep her out of school and keep doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at me on camera, you can see that I am an older person. And I think that is where it started for me and Sandy, I think you talked in another episode about the relationship that homeschooling has allowed
Mhm.
for you with your children. And that's really important for me too. I was 40 when my oldest was born. And my wife and I have always had this like we like being outdoors and we want to be adventurous. But at some point, like you get older and you can't do those things and you never really know when that point is. And so the start of this homeschooling journey for us was me realizing that if I waited until my kids were older to do some of these big adventures that we wanted to do, there's a possibility I may be too old to do that. And I didn't want to miss all those opportunities. And so with that, it's the opportunity to go on the adventure, but then it's like the opportunity to know your kids in a way that I think for me, I've only been able to really get to know people when we're out on the trail together. And I think back to my teaching days and taking kids out on the trail And the relationships that I've built out there have been the most powerful relationships in my life, and I want those relationships with my kids. And that's what started this idea that we can definitely do school while we're having these adventures. And it isn't just going to be making fires and tying knots and all of the kind of outdoor education skills. We can do history, we can do math, we can do economics.
And you can tie it all, it comes up organically in
Right.
as you're adventuring.
Yeah, and so, tying back to the introduction, we were talking about me teaching project-based learning. What I learned when I was teaching project-based learning is that everything that we do has gotta be real. It's gotta be genuine, and it's gotta be
Yeah.
useful. And when we achieve that in a project or in a lesson, what we get are kids that are naturally motivated to wanna
Mhm.
do whatever it is that we're doing. I've been fortunate that my kids are like, they love being outside. They love these adventures that we go on. So as we continue to grow into bigger adventures, they want that. And so they're the ones, like, at this point now with an 8 and a 5-year-old, they're the ones driving these trips as much as I am and saying where they wanna go. And that's really helped them want to grow into these bigger trips, carry a bigger pack so that we can bring more of the things we need to go farther and be more comfortable. If I could I tell a story?
Absolutely. Please tell a story.
So, sitting around the kitchen last year, in the last winter, actually, and I'm whatever, messing around in the kitchen trying to cook something, and my daughter Amelia, who's 7 at the time, is sitting at the kitchen table, and she looks up at me and she says, "Hey, couldn't we do a trip where it's just the kids leading the trip? Like the adults don't do any work?" And we've been working with we live down near Rochester now, so we're working with a co-op down here that's, pretty small, 6 or 7 families, but we've been doing quite a bit with them. And she said, "Yeah, I wanna do a trip where the kids do all the leadership, the kids do all the work, and the parents just sit there and don't do anything." And I'm like, "Well, this I love this idea. So you telling me all I need to do is sit in a chair and you guys are gonna do this work." And so it started, and I asked, "All right, well, maybe why don't you write up some kind of invitation so that we can communicate this." And so she did. She grabbed out a piece of paper and she wrote a half page. So she's working on her spelling and sentence structure and all of that. And she does a rough draft and a final draft. And then we posted it onto Facebook to the group. And within an hour, we had written responses from 7 families saying, "Yes, we want to do this. We want to help." And so we took it from there. We had all the kids come over to our house and stuck them in a tent together. This is winter, so we use a canvas wall tent with a wood stove so that we all survive the experience. And it's nice and warm in there. And the kids, I had them sit down with a notebook and write out a list of the skills that they would need to be able to pull this off. And so I mean, it was chaos in there. They were yelling at each other and everybody's trying to get a word in. And then eventually they figured out how to organize themselves and talk so that everybody's voice could be heard. And after an hour, they had a list of the things that they wanted to work on. They needed to learn how to build a fire. They needed to learn how to cook. They needed to learn how to take a recipe and turn it into a grocery list. They needed to set up tents, all the things that would go into just a camping trip. And so we made a plan. They asked me to teach it to them, and we got together with them every couple weeks and we worked on one of the skills until it was mastered. By the time we got to April, they were ready. And in April, then we went on this trip. We went to a state park. They wanted to learn some history, so we did the Civilian Conservation Corps, and we looked at some of the buildings that they put up at Interstate State Park. And the kids pulled it off. The parents sat in chairs watching these kids arguing about how to start a fire, how to cook on it. They got all their tents set up. They did all the work that they needed to do.
Was
And
that
go ahead.
yes, was that hard for you to not interject or not do anything for them?
Yeah, not intervene. Yeah.
It's gotten easier over the years because I mean, it's a goal. I think any teacher's goal at some point should be to become obsolete in your students' lives.
Mhm.
And so for me, I get to watch that happen right before my eyes. And it seems like each trip it happens a little bit as more gear gets transferred out of my pack into their packs and they can carry it. I loved every minute of sitting and watching it, to be perfectly honest. It felt like it was reaffirming of what I was trying to accomplish with them. And yeah, and watching them kind of grow up right before me and before my eyes. And they did it really well. What they noticed is that half of the group was very engaged and they were working together and they were getting everything done. And then there were some kids that were, not as much. So trying to strategize and bring those kids into it and see what they could do with that. And fast forward that to now we've got the same group of kids meeting weekly or every other week in my yard, and we're teaching a U.S. government class where we're studying the Constitution, and they are trying. They're because they have some experience in self-government now and trying to figure out
Oh.
how to govern themselves, it makes for a more interesting discussion when we're trying to figure out, like, how this country was set up and the laws that we use every day, and can we apply those laws then when we're out on an adventure like that?
I'm taking notes, by the way.
Okay.
Okay, how do you find the sweet spot between comfort and outright terror in all this? Like, so you're letting them do these hard things. I mean, hard, physically hard, but also hard in like trying to work things out with other people. Like we've talked about the
Mhm.
3 areas of growth that happen in these genuine learning experiences, and that is character, relationships, and intellect. And so, just learning to work with other people. We've been trained to have our minds go straight to the academics, like, oh, see how they're doing math and economics in planning for these trips. But also, and you did say like that they organized themselves. And I want to list some specific skills that they gleaned from that. In addition to being able to organize themselves, teamwork, actively listening, negotiating, compromise, and then planning, as you described. Kids want a challenge. They want to work. I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but in general, I believe that the vast majority of kids want a challenge and want to work. And there is something that's not right in their mentorship or environment when that is dead. I don't mean to sound accusing. I'm just saying that instead of dismissing it and saying they're lazy, they're inherently lazy, we should look into what can we change in our mentorship or environment that can bring that out in them.
Because without that challenge, they just become apathetic and they're just waiting to be told what to do. And the danger of that is when they grow up, when does that shift and when does that change and when do they learn these skills? And so as cool as being in the outdoors is, it's not the trip that's important. Like the trip is the vessel that is teaching them the most important life skills that they could possibly gain. And there's all these little extra things, but those things that you just listed, Angel, are the skills and the knowledge, the most important knowledge that they could be gaining. And it's possible because they're not having to sit in a classroom for 8 hours. They have the opportunity to be creative. And we've talked a lot about that creativity before. And so their brains are and they're excited about it. Like their brains are lighting up and they're so excited. And as that carries through with them to adulthood, you are raising incredible adults because they are gaining the skills to continue to push themselves, to try, to challenge themselves, to think critically. And it's just really exciting to
It is so
see all of
exciting.
the pieces.
I just have all the good feels as you're telling these stories, Ben. It's just like resonates. It feels so good and right and powerful. I'm going to read that question again since I asked the question and then I just started talking. So, how do you find the sweet spot between pushing them outside of their comfort zones and doing hard things and outright terror or something that's just beyond their abilities? And have you ever made a mistake in that, either bringing them too far outside their comfort zone and abilities or underestimating how much they can handle?
I love the question. The approach has always been to be very deliberate about teaching kind of a self-reflection of where are you right now in this continuum between being in your comfort zone. Here's how we set it up. And I've done this individually with my own kids, and I've done it in groups with other kids. We take 2 ropes. You take a small rope, make a circle, and then take a bigger rope and make a larger circle around that. So you picture like a target, small circle in the middle. And in the middle is your comfort zone. And on the outside of that big rope is your panic zone. And in between there is the stretch zone where all of our growth is taking place. And so that's kind of the visual that I've always used with my kids and with other people's kids to figure out where we are in a moment. And so in that exercise, we can throw out examples. All right, you're in the boundary waters and you're covered with mosquitoes. So where would you stand in that? Many people would probably stand in the panic zone with that. Some people would be in the comfort zone with that, and people would be anywhere in between, or a severe thunderstorm coming through, or anything that you can imagine, a bear in your camp. But in those moments, I've found that that dialogue of where are you right now? Are you in your panic zone? Usually, just in having that conversation brings somebody back, at least into the stretch zone, where we can have a conversation about it and we can learn how to cope with something. So let me give a
Mhm.
specific example.
I love this.
So this was a trip actually 2 weeks ago, and it was Amelia and James and me taking out a family to the Boundary Waters on a big canoe trip, 5-day trip, and the other family had never been out there before. A huge storm rolled in, and it kinda came in suddenly. So we were like, we could see that there was gonna be some rain, so we had a tarp up, and we had a dry place to be, and we're kinda gathered around underneath there, and we had just finished eating dinner, and all of a sudden, the loudest thunder I have ever heard in my life. Like, just not a slow rumble that kinda builds up, but just like a boom, like a bomb went off right over our heads, and I think a tree may have been struck within it couldn't have been more than a quarter mile away. But my kids have ridden out a lot of storms, and this one, like, it startled me to the point where my heart was racing, and I look at, like, my youngest, James, he's crying, he's screaming his head off, and my daughter's starting to cry too, and this family that we're with, kids are pretty upset. I think the parents that we're with, like, it got all of us. We were all pretty frightened by it. And I think in a moment like that, it's important for me to not pretend that it doesn't scare me also. And, like I'm a human being, and compared to a storm, I'm pretty small. And
Mhm.
so I think there's an opportunity here to have a discussion about how I'm feeling and then how they might be feeling. And so pulling the kids, like we're still under the tarp, we're staying dry, but now we've got all this thunder and lightning going on all around us. And so I took the kids over and we looked at a tree that was growing, put our hand on the tree. And I asked them, like, how old do you think this tree is? And so we were looking, it was a huge white pine. And so they looked at it and like, it's pretty old. It's probably been here 100 years. How many storms do you think this tree has gotten through and survived? And so like we were able, just in having this conversation, I asked the kids, I'm like, how do you feel now? If this tree can make it through all these storms, do you think we can make it through this storm? And I don't like, I didn't solve their problem for them. I didn't take away their fear, but I think we reduced it down to a size that we could work with. And my 5-year-old was able to take a deep breath. We were able to get through. I mean, the storms passed pretty quickly. So our heart rates came back to normal and we passed through. It ended up just being a little speed bump in the trip. It wasn't the trip. It was just that small part of it. We've had similar discussions when we talk about comfort zone versus panic zone, kids getting leeches, kids getting covered with mosquitoes. I mean, there's plenty of discomfort out there to find, but we've kind of learned to, as a family, kind of embrace those things. And the discussion that we often have is if you're in your comfort zone, then you tend to want to stay in your comfort zone. You need to be comfortable. And pretty soon, the things that used to be in your stretch zone now are in your panic zone because you haven't spent enough time pushing yourself out of that. And I really don't want my kids to be dependent on being comfortable to be happy.
Have you read The Comfort Crisis? Have you heard of the book, The
I
Comfort
have
Crisis?
heard of it. I have not read it.
I've talked probably on the podcast because I
Yeah,
talk about it all the time. I mean, this is the essence of the book
yeah,
is yes, we are happier and we have less anxiety when we spend time pushing ourselves in our stretch zone outside of our comfort zone. Keep
yeah.
going. I'm taking notes. That's why I'm looking down, by the way.
I trying to balance because I do want my kids to be uncomfortable. And I want them to like when we're trying to define what trip we're going to do, I don't usually try to say, all right, what's the most we can do? What's the farthest we can go? It's more about how far can we go well? And the key is well. Like how are we traveling? Are we screaming and crying and I'm constantly giving motivational speeches up and down the trail to get them through? Or are we traveling far enough that they are getting an adventure, but are they able to bring themselves on that adventure? And I've done some trips with other people that do things a little bit differently, and it's always brought me back to this thing. I want my kids to take themselves on an adventure, and I will go along to make sure they can get there and get home. And if something comes up, I can help them with that. But as a teacher, I feel like a coach and a guide more than I'm just filling up kids with information. And so I'm always looking for that. How far can my kids take themselves with me along to make sure that they can get home okay? And there have been some examples of times that I pushed them too far.
What I'm hearing, Ben, is that, first of all, there are two kinds of hard things. There's the ones that you're in control of, and there are the ones that you're not. So your story of the thunderstorm was something that you were not in control of, whereas how much weight they carry in their pack or how much cooking they do themselves and making fires they do themselves are things that are in your control. First of all, regarding the hard things that you're in control of, it sounds like you're saying that kids are pretty good at determining their own sweet spot of hard. And you use self-reflection and get them to self-observe to help them determine that. But you also use that self-reflection and talking about things to help them cope with the hard things that are not in their control.
We do a lot of talking, the kids and I, and also with the families that we take. Our specialty seems to be taking families who have never been in the wilderness before. We talk about inputs and outputs. And what do we control? We control the inputs. We don't always control the outputs. We don't always control what happens to us out there. A family might ask, what do we need to bring on a Boundary Waters trip, on a canoe trip? And that's a reasonable question. And so then that always is, what do we need to be prepared for out there? It could be, we were out on a trip last week, it was 35 degrees. It was raining. We need to be ready for that. We've done other trips where it was 100 degrees, storming, and we need to be ready for that. And so when we're planning for trips, we really try to think situationally about things that could happen and then try to get the kids to be very deliberate about what they bring to help cope with those things. And then with the idea that we can't prepare for everything that might happen, and we're going to have to use some ingenuity and creativity and problem solving to sort out the rest. And then, like, for Amelia, I was looking back through, we do a video after every trip to kind of celebrate it, and we have
That's cool.
55 videos that she's been, so 55 trips that she's been on. She's got a lot of experience out there.
Wow.
And the more we've done this, the more I think she develops faith in herself to figure it out. She doesn't worry about all the things that could happen because she has enough experience dealing with the unknown with what she has with her and her problem solving skills. And that's always been the goal with these trips, is to get her to that place. And now that we're taking a lot of families with kids about my kid's age, it's really rewarding for me as a teacher to see her take on a leadership role and help other kids kind of get to that same place. And then I'm working with the parents and we're making sure we have what we need, but it's the kids leading the kids. This idea that for me as a teacher, I want to make myself obsolete in my kid's life at some point. Like as a parent, I don't, but as a teacher, I want them to be self-taught. I want them to be self-driven. And I am seeing a lot of evidence of that in my 8-year-old and my 5-year-old. And as we continue to do this, I think that's just going to continue to grow. But
Absolutely.
the last thing I was going to say, I think what I learned teaching in Minneapolis to kids that were kind of grumpy about learning and being in a class and trusting adults, especially adults that maybe don't look like them. I think what I had learned is that all learning is self-learning. It's self-taught. And for me as a teacher, I can provide an environment. I can put things in that environment that they might respond to. But ultimately, it's up to the student to teach themselves what it is that they need to learn. And so
Absolutely. It's a myth that one person can educate another. It has
agreed.
to be, yes, they have to want to learn and choose to learn.
Yeah. And I think storytelling is a wonderful way to do that,
hmm
because it puts kids into a story that they're experiencing that story as if they're experiencing it themselves.
But then you take them out to experience it in real life too. So I think there's that valuable balance between the two where you experience things through story and then like Elise said, then at some point in time you have to come out of that story and then you're living it, but you've developed some of these skills from reading another person's experience or hearing another person's story. And then you test that out yourself. The one word that keeps coming to my mind is competence. Like that's what you're building in these kids is competence, and they're gaining confidence and competence in themselves and their own abilities and their ability to handle no matter what life throws at them. And they're doing it in this what seems almost dangerous, but in this safe way. So you're giving them this, it's that comfort. They're like right on the edge of that piece of comfort so that they're safe but uncomfortable, and then they experience it, and then it just can continue to build capacity for that as they experience it more and more.
The safety thing is an interesting discussion because the trips we're paddling down rapids, we're walking along the edge of a cliff, like Angel, your son Charles, running up to the top of a mountain. I mean, there are risks that we do take with that, and I wouldn't necessarily describe it as safe for everyone. It's safe depending on the choices you make, and so it's been an opportunity, these trips, to help the kids understand that this trip will be determined by every single step that they take. And so, if they can be present for that step and pay attention to where they're stepping and how they're stepping, then we can do this trip really well. But if they're not, I mean, we've had some kids that couldn't take 7 steps without falling on their face, and depending on where you do that, it's not necessarily a safe trip. The safety is in the choices that we make, and so we try to make those choices very deliberately, whether it's what we're packing to bring along on the trip or how we're traveling, or even just sitting on the edge of a lake looking at 3-foot waves and trying to decide if we should be out on that in a canoe. The wilderness trips that we do, I would not describe as inherently safe. It can be, but it's based on risk assessment, which is, I think, part of
Mhm.
becoming a competent adult is being able to
Mhm.
assess your own risk. And I'm really thankful my kids are getting a chance to practice that, and the kids that are coming along with us are hopefully getting that as well.
Yeah. So one of the quotes I really love, he just says, allow your kids to do dangerous things carefully. And I feel like that's what you're doing. You're putting them in this environment where it is potentially dangerous, but you're taking the means of which you need to do it carefully. You're not foolishly doing that. In fact, I think that's part of how I've learned to define courage. Courage is doing something not foolishly, like running into danger foolishly. That's not courage. Courage is when you're pushing outside something you're uncomfortable with, but you know that it's like you've taken all those safety measures, or you know that the greater good that comes from pushing outside of that comfort zone.
And the research suggests that that's likely why a lot of teenagers take stupid risks and legitimately put their lives and safety in danger, is
Right.
because they haven't had enough experience
Mhm.
taking smart risks and being allowed to take risks. I read one specific study on tree climbing that found that parents in America really micromanage how far and which trees their kids climb, or don't let them climb at all. If
Yeah.
they let them climb them, then they say you're only allowed to go up to this branch. They tell them how far up they can go and which branches they can go on and which ones they can't, as opposed to like Ben's approach, which is self-observation, self-reflection. As a
Mhm.
mentor, we can ask, hey, does that branch test it out first. How flimsy does it feel? Does it feel like it could hold you?
Mhm.
And then if they fall from a lower branch, then it's not so, the consequences aren't
Yeah.
too long term.
Let me read the
Yeah.
full quote here, Angel.
Okay,
He says,
go for it.
don't interfere when your kids are doing dangerous things carefully. When you look out the window and they're climbing a tree, when you come to pick them up from a friend's house and they're skateboarding, when they're going up a ladder to jump off the high dive, override your instinct to yell, hey, stop that, you're going to hurt yourself. Don't infect them with your nervousness and anxiety.
I love that.
Beautiful.
I feel as a dad, kind of eh, I feel kind of risk averse sometimes, and I look at my kids and I don't want them to ever get hurt. I don't want them to ever experience anything negative, but I know as a teacher that's not going to help them in anything that they want to do in their lives. And so constantly trying to check myself and look at my kids for who they are, and can they, like, do I think that they can do something without getting hurt? And then I try to just step back and let them do it. I remember back to when I was teaching in high school and I had a group of high school students in the project-based learning that we were doing. The project they came up with is they wanted to go find the island where the last living resident of the Boundary Waters, Dorothy Moulter, the root beer lady, they
Mhm.
wanted to find her island where she lived. And so all their projects were based on doing a history of who she was and history of the Boundary Waters and how different laws changed who could live there and who couldn't, looking at maps and organizing themselves, like all the aspects of a trip. They did it. And then we went on the trip, but it was the middle of October. And so the weather up there is kind of tricky at October. So we went in, they found the island, and we did everything that the trip that we wanted to do with it. But then on the way out, we were paddling on Moose Lake, which is a very large lake, runs east and west, and we had big wind out of the west. And so there's these 3-foot, 4-foot waves, and it's cold out because it's the middle of October. And so we have 4 boats full of kids and me and one other teacher, and we're paddling along. And I'm looking at it thinking, we don't want to, this is a terrible place to be. But I also want my kids to learn the lessons. And so I pulled everyone together in a group. Like, what do you guys think about these conditions? And so they put their heads together and started talking, and they said, it's risky out here. The risk is one of these boats is going to tip over. I said, okay, so how much of a possibility is that? Like, of 4 boats, how many do you think you can get across there safely? And they're like, well, we could probably get 3. There's a pretty good chance that at least one of us is going to tip over. I'm like, well, do you have a plan for how to get that boat out of the water and get the students out of the water and warm them back up? And so we worked through this conversation, and at the end, they put their heads together and they decided that the risk was worth it. And they decided they wanted to paddle through these waves. And so that's the point for me where I'm self-reflecting and saying, yeah, I want them to learn a lesson. I want them to learn the consequences of their choices. But I also, like, I've had over the years, 100% survival rates, and I'm trying to keep that. And so, like, no, I hear the conversation you're having. However, we're not going through those waves. We're going to go over to the shore. In this case, you've made the wrong decision. And so there can be a moment of me telling them what to do.
Well, because you have wisdom and experience, and their
Mhm.
lives were legitimately at risk. Yes.
But I think even in doing that, I can work through the conversation so that it's not just me telling them what to do. It's them understanding
Mhm.
why I'm
Yeah.
explaining to them what to do. And so we did. We pulled into the shore, and then about an hour later, we heard helicopters going overhead, and it was a different group that had passed us up that had to be rescued by the search and rescue.
Wow.
It wasn't us because of the decision that we made, and the other people were fine, but that was a powerful moment for us, and the next time we were in a spot like that, the kids' conversation was a little bit different about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't, but that risk assessment is a constant conversation. With my kids, especially when it's just me with the 2 of them, and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, it's a million-acre wilderness full of lakes that are all connected by portages, and so these portage trails, some of those are going back thousands of years they've been used. But we're carrying all of our gear over these trails, and I'm carrying a canoe and a 50-pound pack, and the kids are carrying whatever they can carry. I oftentimes have to make 2 trips. I don't need them making 2 trips, so I have to be able to trust that they can assess risk and not do something foolish while they're a mile away from me in a wilderness area. And so we're constantly having that conversation about why that the trust that I need to give them, that they need to earn from me, is the only reason we can do these trips.
You mentioned that building stronger relationships of mutual trust with your children or your students has been the biggest benefit of outdoor experiences. Do you want to go a little deeper into that? Do you have any other stories that illustrate that? Because I thought that was a great example of how you need trust on these trips. And I mean, what a real life skill to be able to take that. Hey, we're working together as a team to survive out in the wilderness and to just accomplish our goal of like getting from point A to point B. Like, what an amazing real life skill. But tell us more about how you've developed that trust and how you've seen it play out in other areas of your life.
Yeah, building trust with my kids. So that's trust that I have for them, and it's trust hopefully that they have for me as well, is the only reason these trips are possible. At any moment, they could make a decision that would get them injured or create some emergency situation that would make these trips incredibly unsafe. For them, they understand that because we talk about it a lot. And that conversation usually is at home. I can think of, so James, when he was 3, and we were living down here in southern Minnesota on our 13 acres of forest, and I lost him. I didn't know where he was. Going outside and I'm yelling for him and he's not answering. And so I spent a half an hour walking around the woods looking for my 3-year-old, trying to figure out where he was. And it was terrifying. And so my fear is rising up in me, and I'll decide I'm going to just our driveway is about a third of a mile long. So I'm walking down the driveway toward the highway that we live on. And I'm just thinking, where could this kid have gone? And I get a little further down the road and I see him, and he's sitting there 20 feet back from the road. As a parent, all this fear is up in me. I want to yell at him. I want to tell him, what are you doing? How can you? But I try to calm myself down. I go up and I just like, what are you doing? And he turns and he looks at me and he says, I wanted you to trust me. So I'm sitting back 20 feet from the road and waiting for grandma to come. So my mom was coming for the day and he wanted to go wait for her. And in his 3-year-old mind, he's still thinking about trust because he knows that trust is like these trips. It's what makes them happen. And so I think he understands that he has to be trustworthy. And so he makes his decisions based on wanting to build trust with me. And we have conversations like that, but we also talk about how trust is something that breaks quickly and fixes slowly. And so there are consequences to lying, to making poor choices when he's out there. And so I think he's constantly, that's in his mind. And
So I
so
want to interject really quick that
please.
when children are attached to an adult, ideally a parent, they want to earn that parent's trust. Like trust is part of that attachment and that bonding. And so he was seeking to please you. And I think it was more about pleasing you than even just going on the trips. I mean, that's definitely part of it. But he's thinking more, I love my dad and my mom, of course. But in this particular situation, I love my dad more than anything in the world. And I want to earn his trust. I want to show him that I can be trusted. When they don't feel like they're bonded to you or love you, then it doesn't necessarily happen.
There's a good book that illustrates that principle. Maybe that's what you're referring to, but
That's what I'm referring to.
yes, hold on to your kids. And it talks about how, like, building that, whoever they spend the most amount of time with, that's who they're going to bond with, and how important it is that they're bonding with their parent who has their best interest at heart, instead of with a peer who is aimless as well. And so that's what you're building there, is that bond, so that they're attaching to the right person.
I love that. Yes, who has their best interests in mind, because they will, if they cannot attach to a parent, they will attach to a peer. That's so beautiful. I thought of a quote from Tim Ferriss, who's a business guru. He wrote The 4-Hour Workweek. He said, "It's amazing how IQ seems to double when you give someone responsibility and show them trust," or something like that, which I think kind of sums this up. We mostly talked about the importance of helping your kids do hard things and face the unknown and take risks, and then building those relationships and that trust through these wilderness adventures, which really could be through a lot of family passions and pursuits. But I guess, what can we relax about and let go of as homeschool families? Because this might seem like this is one more thing I have to do to homeschool families. Like, now nature seems really important. I have to make time for that. Or even just anything. Now I have to pursue my passions. Okay, that's one more thing I have to do. I think it's easy for homeschool families to get overwhelmed. What can we relax and let go of as homeschool families? Or what do we need to let go of in order to make room for these kinds of powerful learning experiences?
I think you can let go of the plan that requires kids to learn specific subject areas. And I'm not suggesting like it doesn't matter. The learning can take its own shape on these trips, and it doesn't need to be engineered by the person who's bringing the kids to the trip. So much of what we do is generated by the questions that my kids encounter for themselves while we're doing these adventures. And sometimes those questions come up beforehand because it's a place they've been to before and they want to know these things because they know they had these questions. And sometimes we go to a new place and new ideas come to them afterwards. And so then it's something that we do after the fact. But the learning on these trips, there's a huge opportunity for it to be inquiry-based, where the kids are doing the inquiring. And I think to overplan the academics of a trip is sometimes taking away that opportunity for the kids to drive their own learning. And so many of the things that, for James as a 3 or a 4-year-old, I remember like we went up to the North Shore and I thought we were just going to pick up rocks and maybe we talk a little geology while we're up there. And instead we go to the Shipwreck Museum in Split Rock Lighthouse, and we end up like that kid's the next 6 months. That's what we're talking about, are the shipwrecks on Lake Superior, which leads to a discussion of industry and why those ships are even on Lake Superior in the first place. And then it's listening to, I can't think of the singer at the moment, but the Edmund Fitzgerald.
The Edmund Fitzgerald song. Yes, I just heard that.
Yeah, like that was probably like my number 3 on Spotify listening for that year, because we just listened to it over and over. And
I think I need a demonstration. Can you sing that, please? I don't know it.
You listeners, if you start getting me singing.
The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Something like that.
That's the one. Yeah.
I'll send you a link, Sandy.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's quite a song. But like going into these trips, I've always got some idea of something we might learn along the way, and I'll bring a lot of materials that would maybe support that. But oftentimes what we take from it is nothing that we planned. It's something completely different. And I had a director when I was teaching who He said, if the teacher is doing the majority of the work, then you're doing it wrong because it's not
Mm-hmm.
their education, it's theirs. They should be doing most of the work. And so you're setting up your classroom or you're setting up your homeschool so that the kids are motivated to want to do the work, most of it themselves. And so these trips are a way to just bring them to places where they're going to encounter sparks for questions that then they're going to need answers to, and we can help guide them to those answers, or at least give them the materials to figure it out for themselves.
That's so beautiful. I'm going to recap what you said. Here's what I heard. Okay, let go of the plan. I would say that's true all the time, even if you're not doing an academic curriculum that you feel like you have to stick to. I entirely immerse my children in whole learning experiences, stories, and purposeful work and trips like these. And yet, even then, you need to still be willing to let go of the plan and shift gears like you did with, oh, well, I thought we were going to focus on geology at Lake Superior. But instead, our interests were drawn to the Edmund Fitzgerald shipwreck. And so you dove into that. Fear of not covering everything. We can let go of that because so much of it unfolds organically in these trips or these projects or passions that you pursue or through the stories that you read.
If I could just say, my biggest takeaway from this is the trust that you have in your kids. And I'm not talking about the trust that you have in them in the way that you discuss, like, if I can't see you, not in that way, but you trust them to be wise enough to lead their own education. Like, you have faith in them that they're going to be curious. And because they feel that from you, then they are curious and they do ask questions. And then you trust yourself enough to, like, you step back and you listen and you hear them and you let go of your own plan so that you hear them and you allow them, as you said in the very beginning, to steer that ship, and you trust their abilities, even at this really young age, the trust you have in them to ask questions and to develop and learn without you having to be the master of it. That's the takeaway that I've got, that I want to do a better job in my home as well.
I think the trust that we give our kids eventually becomes the trust that they give themselves, and then that allows them to be the adults that I hope they can be. But I don't know what exactly, I don't know what they'll do with all of that, but I'm excited to watch and see what happens as they get older. Way off in the future is me as an old man watching and seeing what they do with all this. And I'm not going to sit here and say I can't wait for that because there's a lot to do between now and then, but that would be a good day. And it'll be like when I look back at was all this worth it? That'll be a moment I can imagine that it's going to feel pretty good.
If this podcast was helpful for you, please leave us a review and share with a friend.
Until next time, start with stories and everything else will follow.
You can learn more about our other education projects at angelselda.com and wonderwelllearning.com.